Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the RICO and the RHA workshop. My name is Jack Semple. I'm Director of Policy at the RHA, so it's my job to represent to government in Brussels, London, twice in London, Edinburgh, Belfast, Cardiff, and local authorities, the interests of the industry. And we've been looking particularly at the EU referendum. So if you'd like to ask a question, we'll see how we get on. It might be slightly difficult because we don't have a roving mic, but I'd like to make this as interactive as is possible within this space, both now and the future. That's my contact detail. So compliance in the EU referendum, what will change? I've identified three specifics rather than look at generalities. Three specifics, and hopefully we can have a bit of fun as well as a bit of serious thought. The first thing that I want to dispose of quickly is HMRC. The RHA has been doing a lot of work with the HMRC, or talking to the HMRC a lot of late, and there's a fair bit of confusion, which is the main reason that's there. Because on tax issues, the EU has very little influence. So in these areas, nothing will change as a result of the EU referendum, although the whim of HMRC may be another issue. If you don't know about the new £5 meal allowances, please check that out. That's from April this year. And we'd also like to highlight the overnight subsistence rate up to the agreed RHA HMRC rate, which is currently £26.20. You do not need to check receipts, unlike what it said until very recently on gov.uk, and we've had an apology from HMRC for that. So that's there partly because it's not going to change, and partly because HMRC has been giving incorrect information to the industry and the professional companies that advise the industry. I'd also like to look at driver's hours regulation and driver CPC, which are very important to our industry, very topical, and absolutely to do with Brussels. So let's look at the driver's hours. And we've split up to four options here, which I'd like to go through. One obvious option is we can keep 561/2006, which is the EU driver's hours regulation that we all know and love, and the RHA is the tachograph chart analysis service or record analysis service, and other people have magnets to defeat it and all the rest of it. That's what we all know and love and have got used to. So do we keep it? Do we like it? Do we not like it? Serious question. And I'll come back to why, one of the reasons I've chosen it in a moment. If we come out of if we choose to remain, we can talk about what happens to 561. If we choose to leave, then in theory at least, all options are before us. One option would be to adopt the long-standing GB driving hours rules. So, believe it or not, van operators are subject to it, although I was talking to members again only recently about how the vans never stop. And so are certain classes of HGV operations can also run under HGV driving hours rules, and basically it says you can drive 10 hours a day. And that has the virtue of simplicity. No limits in terms of how many days a week, when you have to take a break, or anything else. It dates back many decades. We can scrap all the driver's hours regulations. So we say we're scrapping 561, and we're not going to have anything at all. Why not? We have that freedom. In fact, one of the think tanks that you hear about asked me about that several years ago. And said, how about just leaving it basically to the insurance industry? And you heard in the last session from the insurance industry, I'm not sure they would love this or not, actually. It's an interesting question. But scrap it and let road safety and insurance take the strain. My response at the time when I was asked was, there may be road safety implications. What I've called something new, what I've called the Boris option. Now, when Boris Johnson gave his first speech on Eurosceptic speech, about 20 months ago now, I got a call from the Wall Street Journal saying that's a big win for the RHA, and a clue what they were talking about. They said, well, Boris, of all the thousands of regulations and directives come out of Brussels, Boris chose 561 to ridicule in his presentation and say how ridiculous this was an example of how bad Brussels is. So that's an issue, an option. I've asked TfL what that was based on and what he was proposing to replace it with. All I've had was a shrug of the shoulders several times. But those are the options. So this is the sort of thing I'm not sure anybody in this room is going to vote in or out just on the basis of what happens to transport regulations. But within the area that we know about, it's an interesting issue. And if there's anybody got any questions on this, please let me know. Because, as I say, I would like to take a bit of a vote on it. But I'll probably come back to that at the end. We move on to what for the politicians is probably the most contentious issue in Brussels. This is what the politicians at Westminster have heard most about in terms of complaints. The driver CPC. Now, we all know that it wasn't invented here, it wasn't welcomed here. The RHA, before my time I have to say, but I've seen the record, the RHA did a very good job in ensuring that it was not more onerous and more restrictive than it is now. But nonetheless, it's here, it's a legal requirement. The importance of that legal requirement has been emphasised by our own GB regulator, the traffic commissioners, who've said it's a very important indicator of repute if you don't do the DCPC training. But again, we have 4 options, I would suggest. We stick with the driver CPC directive, which, to be honest, I'm not sure many people in Europe are entirely happy with. And it's under review at the moment, in Brussels. Or we can design a CPC equivalent within the UK. This is, remember, we've come out of the EU. This is a hypothetical situation, so we can do whatever we like. And as transport operators, I think it's interesting to challenge ourselves as to what would we do if we had a clear sheet of paper. What would we do? Would we ditch it completely, option 3, and go back to what we had in the days of the Volvo F12, days of Tony Blair and the last days of Gordon Brown, where you didn't have to do any training in the industry? And let's face it, there was very little training in the industry. The quality of drivers coming into the industry wasn't particularly good unless they had a very good trainer, and even some that many of the large companies just threw the driver a key, expected them to get on with it. So do we want to go back to that? Which is certainly the low-cost option. Do we want to give this to the devolved authorities? So I'm thinking back to Boris here and all he's been doing in London. Presumably Boris wouldn't want to adopt the GB driving rules of 10 hours a day without arrest driving around London. He'd want to have a say in what this looks like. Now, it's a little provocative. I've got Sadiq Khan there, the new mayor, and Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister in Scotland. They would both, I'm sure, love to have the opportunity to design their own standards. So these are the sort of issues I would suggest that are likely to come up if we vote to come out, certainly, but also if we vote to remain and we decide as an industry, and certainly the RHA, to re-energise and increase our voice within Europe to get what makes sense to the UK and to the industry. And I have to say, I would want to get the UK government to do that as well, because my own personal impression is that they've not been engaged with Brussels nearly as much as they could have been and should have been. And let's face it, we don't know what goes on in Brussels because for 40 years the media hasn't told us anything other than the shape of bananas. And I speak as somebody who spent 25 years as a journalist. And I probably followed more in transport than you read about in the national press. So we have a real issue here with 2 examples in terms of transport regulations that come out of Brussels, and one to do with, there's nothing to do with Brussels, so you could add also fuel duty tax rates, roads, they're nothing to do with Brussels, but there's a lot that is. And if you would like to read the report that I wrote at the request of the board in mid-February, it goes through some of these issues, not in huge detail, but in a bit of, explores them a bit. So, any questions? Any thoughts? Is this an issue in terms of Europe that you are completely undecided about, completely in the dark about? The relevance to this, I have to emphasize that after the vote, certainly, the RHA will be pushing harder, certainly in the driver CPC. The driver's hours regulation, we haven't, frankly, because every time you raise the issue, it becomes more restrictive and less attractive to the industry. What we would like to see, and I haven't mentioned it, but I should do, is the Road Transport Directive and working time, which covers the same subject and requires an extra lot of record keeping. That is an example of Brussels at its worst. I'm sure we can think of examples of other UK and devolved government not being very clever either. So our current policy is that if there's going to be reform, those two should be merged into a single directive. But in terms of the driver CPC, I think this is a real opportunity. My own view is that something that was invented not least by the Spanish to try and make lorry driving more attractive, believe it or not, and by the French, who I'm not sure are actually doing it very rigorously. But I have seen at our regional councils members who were deeply antagonistic towards the driver CPC. About 3 years in, when the economy started to stabilise and demand started to stabilise and they started to give a bit of thought to it, actually saying, well, now that we're doing it and taking it seriously, we're getting business benefit from it. And the RHA's policy at the moment is that customers should look for evidence of regular driver CPC training as an indicator of a good haulage supplier. And we are also looking to develop a culture and a reality where transport managers who are responsible for compliance in the business have refresher training. Because at the moment there is no requirement for refresher training. I'm sure the traffic commissioners would like it, but there is no requirement. And what I would like to see the UK doing is not having Brussels inventing it for us this time because we're not doing anything, but to be able to demonstrate that actually we have our industry in good order and we don't need a mandatory requirement invented somewhere else. But as I say, either now or subsequently, be really interested in any questions, any comments on any of this. So I'm going to ask for a vote in turn for each of these four options. We keep EU 561/2006 or something similar to it. Show of hands for that. We move to GB driver's hours rules, 10 hours a day. Anyone for 10 hours a day? Okay. We scrap all the regulations, driver's hours completely. We have one for that. Good. And something completely new, which I've called the Boris option. I said we'd try and have a bit of fun. So we have two for something completely new. I have to say, I am slightly surprised that Boris chose to highlight this of all the regulations he could have chosen, but then maybe he wasn't expecting much comeback on that. Which of course he didn't get. Now on this issue, and this is really interesting because this is a live issue. Do we stick with a driver CPC directive, which I guess which is being reviewed at the moment, and maybe we could have a bit of reform, but basically do we stick with the driver CPC directive? Show of hands for that. Do we design a UK driver CPC equivalent? Do we go back to driving test only? In other words, no, one for that. And do we leave it to the devolved mayors? Who's going to be brave enough to vote for that? Okay, I think it's really interesting. I think the issue of the driver's hours, I think, would be really interesting to hear from members and those who are voting for a UK option. Personally, I would be really interested to hear what that might look like, because I think that could inform some policy and some enforcement issues, and it'd be interesting to have that conversation within the industry. Boris was clearly, and I think in terms of the driver CPC directive, I think we've got a really interesting conversation to have there. What is also interesting, though, is that I suspect there was no appetite for some sort of training regime for drivers at all when I joined the RHA, or when I stopped working in motor transport about 9 or 10 years ago, and clearly there's been a shift. I would suggest that the driver CPC, very, very imperfect in my view, though it is, has forced a change in view, and that's an interesting message. But it's also interesting that although there was no appetite at all for anything, there is now no appetite to go back to where we were at that time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. As I say, this is a continuing dialogue. I'd really welcome your input. Thank you.